In the early months of 1915, the war that had been expected to end by Christmas was entering its second spring. Across the Western Front, the landscape of Europe had been transformed into a network of trenches, mud, and shattered villages. What had begun as a contest of maneuver had hardened into a siege of continents. In northern Belgium, around the medieval town of Ypres, a bulge in the Allied line jutted eastward into German-held territory. The soldiers called it the Ypres salient. It was a place of beauty turned to ruin, gentle farmland and poplar-lined roads reduced to a wasteland of shell holes and wire. For the Allies, Ypres symbolized defiance. The British Expeditionary Force had fought its first great stand there the previous autumn, stopping the German advance at terrible cost. The French called the town Ypres la Martyre, Ypres the Martyr. For the Germans, it was an irritant, a wedge that threatened their control of the Belgian coast. Both sides watched the salient uneasily through the long, wet winter, waiting for the next offensive. None of them could imagine that Ypres would soon become the laboratory of a new horror, a weapon that would change the nature of war itself. By April 1915, the strategic situation on the Western Front was stalemated. The great offensives of 1914 had failed. Both sides now dug in behind belts of barbed wire and artillery. Germany, its main armies engaged in the east, sought a limited victory in Flanders that could distract the Allies and test new weapons. The High Command in Berlin approved a plan prepared by General Erich von Falkenhayn and the chemist Fritz Haber: the use of chlorine gas as a battlefield weapon. It was an experiment as much as an attack, an attempt to break the deadlock through science. The Ypres salient, thinly held by a mixture of British, French, and colonial troops, was chosen as the target. The Germans massed more than 5,000 cylinders along a 4-mile front north of the town, each filled with liquefied chlorine under pressure. In total, they contained nearly 170 tons of gas. The plan was simple and terrible. When the wind blew from the right direction, the valves would be opened, and a cloud of poison would roll down toward the Allied trenches. No one on the receiving end had ever faced such a thing. The defenders of the northern sector were colonial troops, men of the French 45th Algerian and 87th Territorial Divisions. Many were veterans of earlier campaigns in North Africa, accustomed to hardship but unprepared for what was coming. To their right were the Canadians, part of the 1st Canadian Division, holding the line around Saint-Julien and Gravenstaffel. Their trenches were shallow, their rifles worn, their artillery inadequate. Yet their morale was high. For many, this was their first major battle, their baptism of fire on European soil. On the afternoon of April 22, 1915, the day began like so many others, damp, gray, and tense. Artillery rumbled intermittently. Reconnaissance planes droned overhead. Then, around 5 p.m., a greenish-yellow cloud began to rise from the German lines near Langemarck. At first, the French soldiers thought it was a smokescreen for an infantry assault. But within minutes, the cloud thickened, drifting low across no man's land, hugging the ground like fog. A strange, acrid smell filled the air, sharp, metallic, almost sweet. Then came the coughing. Chlorine gas attacks the lungs, reacting with moisture to form hydrochloric acid. The men nearest the front, had no protection. They clutched their throats, eyes streaming, gasping as if drowning on dry land. Panic spread faster than the gas itself. Within minutes, the entire sector was in chaos. Soldiers stumbling from their trenches, choking, blinded, dropping their weapons. Horses reared and screamed. Birds fell from the sky. The green cloud rolled inexorably southward, filling dugouts, creeping into every hollow. Where it passed, nothing living survived. A 4-mile gap opened in the Allied line. The French colonial troops, unprepared and suffocating, broke and fled. Thousands lay dead or dying. Thousands more staggered rearward in terror, their faces blackened by chemical burns. Through the gap, the German infantry advanced cautiously, uncertain of the effects of their own weapon. They were astonished by what they saw. Trenches full of corpses, equipment abandoned, the enemy simply gone. In hours they captured ground that weeks of artillery bombardment might not have taken. Yet the Germans hesitated. The gas had shocked even them. They had brought no reserves to exploit the breakthrough fully. In the midst of collapse, the Canadians on the right flank held firm. When word reached them that the French line had dissolved, they realized their position was now exposed on 3 sides. They improvised defenses, dragging up rifles and machine guns to cover the new front. Officers ordered men to urinate on handkerchiefs and press them to their faces. The ammonia in urine could neutralize some of the chlorine. It was a primitive defense, but it worked well enough to keep them fighting. That night, under constant shell fire and half-blind from the fumes, the Canadians counterattacked to plug the gap. They recaptured ground near Saint-Julien, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. Their stand prevented a total disaster. News of the gas spread rapidly through Allied headquarters. Reports were confused, disbelieving. "The enemy is using asphyxiating gas in shells," one message read. "Whole battalions destroyed." The British commanders struggled to understand what had happened. The laws of war, as written at The Hague, forbade the use of poison weapons. Surely Germany would not violate them so blatantly. But the evidence was undeniable. The green fog, the mass of dead men and animals, the smell of chlorine lingering in the trenches. The world had entered a new era of warfare. For the soldiers who survived that first evening, Ypres became a nightmare without end. The wind shifted unpredictably, carrying traces of gas back toward both sides. Eyes burned, throats ached, lungs filled with fluid. Medical teams worked frantically, improvising antidotes from bicarbonate of soda and water. The dead were buried hastily, their bodies stiffened in grotesque postures of suffocation. Even veterans who had endured years of colonial wars admitted they had never seen such horror. One French officer wrote simply, "It was not war as we had known it. It was murder." The Germans, encouraged by the success of their experiment, prepared a second gas release 2 days later. On April 24th, with the wind again favorable, they unleashed another wave of chlorine, this time against the Canadians themselves. Once more the air turned green and deadly. The Canadians fought through the fumes, coughing and half-blind, firing rifles until their bolts seized from heat. Whole companies vanished in the mist. Yet they held. Counterattacks surged and failed, lines bent but did not break. By nightfall, the ground was carpeted with bodies, and the air stank of gas, mud, and cordite. The Second Battle of Ypres had begun in earnest. What followed over the next month would be a struggle not only for territory, but for survival. A battle fought in clouds of poison, under relentless artillery fire, in trenches that had become graves. The men of both sides would come to know the smell of chlorine as intimately as the sound of their rifles. It would linger in their memories for the rest of their lives. By the night of April 24th, 1915, the Ypres salient was a furnace of gas, shellfire, and confusion. The first attack 2 days earlier had torn open the northern flank, but the line still held, barely, because of the stubborn resistance of the Canadians and fragments of British and French units. The trenches were shallow, filled with bodies and mud, the parapets collapsing under bombardment. Above the din of artillery came the hissing roar of gas cylinders being opened again. A second, thicker cloud of chlorine rolled over the front. The moonlight turned it the color of copper. Men screamed warnings along the trenches, shouting, "Gas!" Ypres, as the mist advanced. The Canadians, already exhausted from 2 days of continuous fighting, had only crude protection. They tore up sandbags and shirts, soaked them in water, and tied them over their mouths. Officers urged them to keep their heads low and breathe shallowly. Some filled their mouths with earth or tobacco in the hope of blocking the fumes. The air stung their eyes and seared their lungs. Those who inhaled even briefly began coughing up blood. Yet through sheer determination, they fought on. Machine gun crews fired until they collapsed. Riflemen loaded and shot through tears. In places where entire companies were wiped out, small groups continued the fight alone, holding ground that no longer had meaning. The German infantry followed the gas cloud cautiously, wearing primitive respirators made of gauze and cotton. They expected little resistance. What they found instead were Canadians firing from half-destroyed trenches, refusing to yield. Around Saint-Julien, the 13th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force counterattacked repeatedly, driving the Germans back with bayonets. At Kitchener's Wood, a mixed force of Canadians and British territorials charged through a storm of gas and shell fire, retaking positions that had been abandoned by the suffocating French 2 days earlier. The cost was catastrophic. Whole units reduced to a handful of survivors, but their courage closed the gap in the line and prevented the Germans from breaking through to Ypres itself. Throughout the night, stretcher-bearers moved like ghosts through the green mist, searching for the wounded. Many died before they could reach them. Horses lay in heaps along the roads. Birds had vanished entirely. In the ruined villages behind the front, medical officers struggled to understand the new weapon's effects. The lungs of gas victims were swollen and filled with fluid. Their skin turned bluish-gray. Some died within minutes. Others lingered for hours, drowning slowly in their own bodies. There was no cure, only comfort. Nurses soaked cloths in water and pressed them to scorched faces. The smell of chlorine clung to their clothes and hair for days. By April 26th, the battle had settled into a grim rhythm. Every morning, the German artillery pounded the Allied lines. Every afternoon, the wind shifted, threatening another gas release. Both sides learned rapidly. German engineers improved their masks, adding filters of cotton and charcoal. The Allies improvised countermeasures, towels soaked in urine, hoods made of muslin, goggles smeared with glycerin. But their supply was limited and their design crude. The soldiers joked bitterly that they looked like ghosts in rags. The humor was forced. Everyone knew that another gust of wind could decide their fate. The town of Ypres itself was being pulverized. Once a picturesque medieval center with a soaring cloth hall and ornate spires, it now stood in ruins. Shells had reduced its buildings to blackened shells, its streets filled with rubble and corpses. Civilians who had refused to leave huddled in cellars, their lives measured by the rhythm of bombardments. The British High Command debated withdrawing from the salient altogether, but political and symbolic considerations prevailed. Ypres had become more than ground. It was a symbol of Allied defiance. To abandon it would be to admit defeat. So the orders came. Hold at all costs. Among the troops, the phrase took on an almost fatalistic meaning. Holding the line meant enduring constant shell fire, gas attacks, and the psychological collapse of those who could bear no more. Men became unrecognizable, their faces burned and swollen. The sweet, metallic odor of chlorine soaked into their uniforms and rations. Yet, amid the misery, acts of courage multiplied. Chaplains crawled through the trenches to comfort the dying. Artillerymen, half blind from gas, continued to load their guns. A sense of grim brotherhood bound them together. The shared knowledge that they were living through something new and monstrous. The Germans, despite their initial success, failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The gas, though devastating, was unpredictable. If the wind changed, it could drift back toward their own lines. The element of surprise was lost after the first attack. Allied troops now recognized the signs: the hiss of escaping gas, the sudden discoloration of the air, and braced themselves as best they could. Moreover, the German command had underestimated the scale of reserves needed to exploit the chaos. By the time reinforcements arrived, the Canadians and British had reorganized their defenses. The moment of easy victory had passed. Still, the fighting continued with relentless fury. Between April 26th and May 3rd, the battle expanded along the entire salient. The Germans launched repeated assaults on Hill 60, St. Julien, and Friesenberg Ridge, using artillery and gas to soften the defenses before infantry advances. The British responded with counterattacks of their own, often led by officers who had never seen such slaughter. Trenches changed hands multiple times. Whole battalions vanished overnight. The once green fields of Flanders were churned into brown sludge strewn with bodies. The distinctive poplar trees that lined the roads were shredded into black spikes. Overhead, observation balloons hovered like malevolent eyes, directing the guns. For the Canadians, the end of April marked the climax of their ordeal. On the 27th and 28th, fresh German gas attacks forced them back from St. Julien. Their casualties were staggering, over 6,000 men, nearly a third of their division. But their resistance became legend. Newspapers in London and Ottawa hailed them as heroes who had saved the line, and, with it, the Allied cause in Flanders. The reality was more complex. They had held by instinct and desperation, by improvisation and sacrifice. Many survivors would carry damaged lungs and nightmares for the rest of their lives. The battle had baptized an army and scarred a generation. As May began, the weather turned warmer, and with it came new miseries. The stench of the dead, men, horses, and mules, hung over the battlefield. Flies swarmed in clouds. Water was scarce and foul. Food arrived spoiled. Gas shells, a new innovation, began to appear among the German artillery barrages, spreading smaller but more concentrated doses of chlorine. The Allied soldiers cursed the Huns' devil's breath, yet grimly acknowledged its effectiveness. Commanders demanded gas masks for every man, but production lagged far behind need. Science had opened a door that industry could not yet close. In London and Paris, outrage mingled with disbelief. Newspapers denounced Germany's use of poison as barbaric, a violation of every law of war and humanity. Yet, behind the scenes, Allied chemists began developing gas weapons of their own. The moral shock of Ypres faded quickly in the logic of total war. If the enemy used it, so must we. Laboratories in Britain and France began producing chlorine and, later, phosgene and mustard gas. The race of science had begun, not toward healing, but toward new ways of killing. On the front lines, the soldiers cared little for such debates. Their world had narrowed to survival, to the next shell, the next gas alarm, the next night in the trench. Letters home spoke not of glory, but of endurance. "We live like moles," one Canadian wrote. "The air is poison, the earth is fire." Another described the silence that followed each gas attack, when even the birds seemed afraid to sing. The old rhythms of battle, attack and counterattack, charge and retreat, had given way to something more mechanical, more inhuman. The war was becoming a machine, and men were its moving parts. By the end of April, both sides were exhausted. The Germans had advanced several miles, capturing key ridges north of Ypres, but the salient remained in Allied hands. The town, though obliterated, had not fallen. The first great gas battle in history had ended not with victory, but with stalemate. Yet the psychological line had been crossed. No one could ever again claim ignorance of what modern science could do. The green clouds over Flanders had shown that the age of chivalry was dead and buried in the trenches. By the first week of May 1915, the fields north and east of Ypres had been reduced to a vision of hell. The grass had vanished beneath a crust of mud, shell holes, and tangled wire. The air shimmered with smoke, and the faint, acrid odor of chlorine clung to everything: uniforms, food, even the rain. The battle had been raging for nearly 3 weeks, and though the front lines had shifted only slightly, the cost was catastrophic. Both sides were learning that victory in this new kind of war could mean little more than surviving one more day. The Germans, encouraged by their earlier gains, prepared a final push to seize the remaining high ground of the salient. Their target was Friesenberg Ridge, a low rise that offered commanding views of the ruined town and the roads beyond. Holding it was essential for the Allies. Losing it would expose Ypres to direct observation and bombardment. The British reinforcements that replaced the shattered Canadian units were weary and inexperienced, territorial and new army battalions fresh from training camps in England. They marched into the line through fields littered with corpses, their boots sinking into ground that seemed to breathe decay. Many still wore the khaki of peacetime parades. Within hours, the front would strip that illusion away. At dawn on May 8th, the German artillery opened fire. The bombardment was unlike anything the defenders had yet experienced. Thousands of shells rained down on a front of barely 2 miles, flattening trenches, burying men alive, and turning the landscape into liquid earth. Amid the roar came the unmistakable hiss of gas shells, each explosion releasing clouds of greenish vapor that settled into the hollows. Those caught without protection coughed and retched until they collapsed. Those with improvised masks fought to keep them in place as they worked their rifles and machine guns. Communication lines were cut, officers killed or wounded. Battalions disappeared into the smoke. When the German infantry advanced, they came in gray waves, moving cautiously through the haze. Some wore primitive gas masks with glass eyepieces and long snouts of cloth. To the defenders, they looked less like men than apparitions, faceless, silent, advancing out of the mist. The British fired until their rifles glowed, but the pressure was overwhelming. One by one, the trenches fell. The 2nd Battalion of the East Surrey Regiment, reduced to a handful of survivors, fought to the last man at the crossroads near Friesenberg. The 1st Royal Warwickshires held their ground for 12 hours under continuous shell fire, their commanding officer mortally wounded. When relief finally arrived, there were fewer than 100 men left. Reports from the front reached headquarters in fragments. The telephone lines were gone, runners killed or lost in the chaos. Commanders pieced together the battle from rumor and guesswork. Ypres itself was now under direct fire. Shells struck the great cloth hall and the medieval cathedral, setting them ablaze. By night, the sky glowed red over the ruins, a constant reminder of how close the enemy had come. Yet even as the situation deteriorated, the order remained unchanged. Hold the salient. Every yard of ground was to be defended, no matter the cost. The cost was measured in blood. Entire divisions were reduced to shadows. The trenches, once hasty excavations of mud and boards, became open graves filled with water and the dead. Soldiers slept beside corpses, too exhausted to move them. Gas masks were worn even while sleeping, their straps leaving permanent marks on faces. The sound of coughing filled the nights. The gas had burned men's lungs so badly that many could barely breathe. Yet still, they were expected to fight. The wounded who made it to dressing stations were laid out in rows under makeshift tents. Doctors rinsed eyes and throats with water, knowing it would do little good. Morphine was scarce, compassion scarcer still. Among the troops, a grim fatalism took hold. The men joked about the Ypres cough, about the taste of metal in their mouths, about the frogs that now lived in shell holes filled with poison water. They sang songs to keep fear at bay. In one battered trench near Saint-Jean, a corporal wrote home, "There is no such thing as safety here. The only way out is to be killed or gassed. But we keep our posts because someone must. His letter never reached home. It was found weeks later among the mud." On May 13th, the Germans attacked again, this time along Belgian Ridge. The British artillery, short of shells, could offer little reply. Gas and high explosives swept through the forward trenches. Once more, the defenders held by instinct and will rather than command. Counterattacks were launched with bayonets and grenades, men charging through the choking haze, their eyes streaming, their boots slipping on the bodies of the fallen. It was fighting reduced to its most primal form, survival against the elements as much as against the enemy. Yet even in defeat, the Allies managed to cling to the battered edges of the salient. The Germans advanced several miles and captured the high ground, but Ypres itself remained in Allied hands. The salient, now a shallow arc of rubble and trenches, was barely defensible, yet it stood as a symbol of endurance. Ypres holds, the newspapers declared, as though the words themselves could make it true. For the men who fought there, the phrase was hollow comfort. The cost of holding had been beyond comprehension. When the battle finally sputtered out in late May, after a final series of gas attacks and local skirmishes, the numbers told their own story. The Allies had suffered more than 70,000 casualties. The Germans, nearly as many. The Canadians alone had lost 1 in every 3 men. The ground gained by the enemy measured only a few miles. The Second Battle of Ypres ended as so many of the war's battles would, with immense slaughter and no decisive result. But its legacy was far greater than its geography. For the first time, chemical weapons had been used on a massive scale. The moral shock of that fact rippled through the world. Even in Germany, where propaganda celebrated the victory, there was unease. The scientists who had designed the gas, including Fritz Haber, argued that it was a humane weapon because it killed swiftly and terrified the enemy into retreat. But those who had seen the aftermath knew better. There was nothing swift or clean about chlorine. It lingered, seeped, and clung. It left men crippled, coughing for months, their lungs scarred beyond repair. It contaminated not just the air, but the conscience of humanity. Among the Allied soldiers, hatred hardened. The gas attacks erased whatever remnants of the old codes of honor had survived the trenches. The war, once imagined as a clash of armies, became a struggle without limits. "We no longer fight men," one British officer wrote. "We fight machines, chemicals, and madness." The phrase captured the transformation taking place, a shift from the romanticism of 1914 to the mechanized despair of 1915 and beyond. In the hospitals behind the lines, rows of gas victims lay in silence. Their faces were wrapped in bandages. Their breathing came in shallow, rasping gasps. Nurses described the smell of chlorine as something that never left their skin. The doctors learned to identify survivors by sound, the bubbling wheeze of lungs dissolving from within. For many, recovery was worse than death. They returned home blind or unable to speak, their bodies ruined by science's new gift to war. By June, the guns around Ypres fell quiet. The battle had burned itself out, leaving behind a landscape of death and innovation. The gas cylinders still lined the German trenches, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. Birds returned hesitantly to the trees, though few sang. The survivors, transferred to other sectors, carried with them the knowledge that the war had changed forever. The green clouds over Flanders would not be forgotten. They would return. At Luz, on the Somme, at Passchendaele, each time more deadly, more sophisticated, more inevitable. For now, Ypres lay in ruins, its medieval towers shattered, its fields turned to mud and memory. The men who fought there called it simply Wipers, their slang name for a place that had devoured thousands and taught the living what the future of war would look like. They could not know that the town would burn twice more before the end, that it would become a symbol not of victory or defeat, but of endurance beyond reason. The Second Battle of Ypres was over, but the poison had already entered the world's bloodstream. When the last guns fell silent over the Ypres salient in late May 1915, the landscape they left behind looked less like a battlefield than a wound carved into the earth. For miles in every direction, the soil had been churned into a brown, lifeless sea of craters. The poplar trees that once lined the Flanders roads were gone, reduced to splintered stumps. The air still reeked of chlorine and decay. In the distance, the ruins of Ypres smoldered, its famous cloth hall a skeletal outline against the pale sky. The battle was over, but its echoes would last for years. In the immediate aftermath, both sides tried to make sense of what had happened. The Germans claimed victory, pointing to the miles gained and the thousands of prisoners taken. Yet among their soldiers, there was little elation. Many were sickened by what they had seen. Even those who had survived unscathed could not forget the sight of enemy soldiers writhing and gasping in the green mist, or the eerie silence that followed when the wind carried the chlorine away. A few officers spoke of scientific progress, of a new age of warfare that would shorten the conflict through terror. But in the dugouts and hospitals where coughing men struggled for breath, the talk was quieter, darker. The line between victory and atrocity had been blurred beyond recognition. For the Allies, the reaction was outrage mixed with disbelief. The use of poison gas violated the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which had explicitly banned chemical weapons. Newspapers in London and Paris denounced Germany's crime against civilization, comparing the gas clouds to medieval plagues. Political leaders vowed that such acts would not go unanswered. But behind the moral condemnation lay a practical truth. The weapon worked. It had broken a line that might otherwise have held indefinitely. And in modern war, every advantage, no matter how horrifying, was seized upon. Within weeks, British and French chemists were at work, developing gas weapons of their own. The arms race had expanded into the realm of the invisible. For the soldiers who had endured the gas, moral debates mattered little. They carried their scars in their lungs, in their eyes, in the trembling of their hands. Those who survived often found that ordinary life no longer felt real. A whiff of smoke could send them into coughing fits. A greenish sunset could trigger panic. Some were discharged as invalids, their health permanently broken. Others returned to the front with makeshift masks and a quiet dread that no preparation could erase. "You could never trust the wind again," one survivor wrote. It had a color now, a smell, a weight. It was alive. The Canadian troops who had held the line in April became national heroes. Their courage under impossible circumstances was celebrated across the British Empire. In Canada, newspapers hailed them as proof that the young nation had come of age. Yet the men themselves spoke little of heroism. Their letters home described confusion, fear, and the choking agony of gas. One wrote simply, "We did not fight the enemy. We fought the air." Their commander, Lieutenant General Edwin Alderson, called their stand a miracle of endurance. But for those who had seen St. Julien and Kitchener's Wood, the word miracle carried a bitter taste. The Second Battle of Ypres also transformed military medicine. Doctors and scientists scrambled to understand the effects of chlorine, to develop better protection and treatment. Gas masks evolved rapidly from wet cloths to purpose-built respirators with filters of charcoal and chemicals. Training manuals were rewritten. Drills introduced. Within a year, every soldier on the Western Front carried a gas mask as essential as his rifle. The weapon that had once shocked the world became a normal part of warfare, just another hazard among many. The normalization of horror was perhaps Ypres' greatest legacy. In strategic terms, the battle changed little. The Ypres salient remained in Allied hands, but it was a death trap, a narrow bulge surrounded on three sides by German artillery. Thousands more would die there in the years to come, in battles that bore the same name but far greater scale. Yet Ypres' importance was not measured in miles. It was psychological. It marked the moment when the Great War shed its last illusions. The gas cloud that rolled over Flanders was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the age itself, an age in which science, stripped of morality, could unleash forces beyond control. The men who fought there sensed this transformation, even if they could not articulate it. Letters and diaries from Ypres are filled with bewilderment. "This is not war," wrote one British private. "It is the end of the world." Another described the battlefield as a place where the earth itself seems poisoned. The old languages of honor and glory had no words for what they saw. The world had entered a new vocabulary of suffering: gas, shell shock, attrition, terms that would define an entire generation. For the civilians who returned to Ypres after the war, the memory was physical as much as emotional. The town had to be rebuilt from ruins, its foundations dug through layers of unexploded shells and bones. Farmers plowing the surrounding fields unearthed helmets, rifles, and fragments of gas cylinders for decades afterward. The soil itself was toxic, stained by chemicals that killed crops and corroded tools. Children grew up playing among relics of the battle, unaware that the rusted metal around them had once changed the world. The land remembered even when people tried to forget. In 1927, the Menin Gate Memorial was erected at the eastern edge of Ypres, bearing the names of more than 50,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who had died in the Ypres salient with no known grave. Every evening since 1928, buglers have sounded the last post beneath its arches, a ritual of remembrance that continues to this day. The ceremony is simple, almost austere, a few notes echoing through the stone archway, fading into silence. Yet, in that silence lies the memory of the green clouds, the choking cries, and the men who fought without hope of escape. Ypres became not just a place, but a synonym for sacrifice. The battle also left a legacy in art and literature. Poets who served there struggled to capture its horror in words. Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, a Canadian doctor who treated the wounded at Ypres, wrote the immortal lines of in Flanders fields, where the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row. The poem, written amid the ruins, transformed the poppy into a symbol of remembrance worldwide. It spoke not of victory or revenge, but of continuity, of the dead speaking to the living, urging them not to forget. McCrae himself would die later in the war, but his words endured, turning the devastated fields of Ypres into a garden of memory. For Germany, the legacy was more ambiguous. The tactical success of chlorine gas was undeniable, but it had earned the nation a reputation for barbarism that would haunt it for decades. The image of German soldiers releasing poison clouds over defenseless troops became propaganda gold for the Allies. Posters depicted the Hun as a monster armed with science and cruelty. In Berlin, some military leaders defended the weapon as necessary. Others feared it had damaged Germany's moral standing irreparably. Even the chemists who had developed the gas were divided. Fritz Haber, hailed as a patriot for his work, was also condemned as a murderer by many of his peers. The duality of his invention, brilliance and horror intertwined, mirrored the age he had helped create. In a broader sense, the Second Battle of Ypres foreshadowed the century to come. It was the first clear demonstration that technology had outpaced humanity's ability to control it. The line between progress and destruction had vanished. The same science that produced vaccines and fertilizers could also produce weapons of suffocation and death. The industrial age had reached its moral climax in a cloud of chlorine drifting over the poppies of Flanders. When veterans of Ypres looked back in later years, their memories were filled less with bitterness than with disbelief. The war had consumed everything: cities, generations, even imagination. Some spoke of the beauty of the dawn light over the shell holes, of comradeship in the trenches, of laughter amid horror. Others said nothing at all. Silence became the truest expression of what they had endured. For many, the sound of a bugle or the scent of damp earth could summon the battlefield as vividly as any photograph. By the time the Second World War erupted a generation later, Ypres had been rebuilt, but its name still carried the weight of tragedy. Soldiers who passed through the town in 1940 saw the same fields, the same ridges, and wondered how many ghosts walked beside them. The poison gas of 1915 had given way to new, even deadlier technologies, yet the essence was the same: humanity struggling to survive its own inventions. The lessons of Ypres had not been forgotten, only ignored. Today, the ground around Ypres is quiet again. The poppies bloom each spring, their red petals fluttering where once the green gas rolled. The Menin Gate still stands, its walls covered in names that no one living remembers, but everyone honors. Tourists walk the preserved trenches at St. Julien and Hill 60, trying to imagine what it was like to breathe that poisoned air. They cannot, not truly. The world has changed too much, and yet not enough. The Second Battle of Ypres remains one of history's turning points, not because of its territorial gains or losses, but because of what it revealed about humanity. It showed that progress without conscience is merely another form of destruction, and that courage can coexist with horror. It taught the world that even in the darkest clouds, there can be light, not of redemption, but of remembrance. And so, in the quiet evenings when the last post sounds over Ypres, the air seems to hold a faint echo of that long-ago spring. It carries not the smell of chlorine, but the memory of endurance, of men who faced the unthinkable and held the line against the wind itself.